The gender discussion in Russia is for sure a very different one to, say, the UK, Italy, Spain, Latin America. And often we refer to Asia Pac as one region. But when you look at the countries we're operating within, even a country in and of itself, as I mentioned, India, they're so diverse within them. So it's just fascinating. So that you need to give empowerment and accountability to a local level and then follow through.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker, and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to companies' bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles both inside and outside work. Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of my Why Care podcast. How do you create local relevance when building a global inclusion strategy? What do you need to be mindful of when designing training that's going to be rolled out across the world? And how do you achieve leadership accountability in each country? In this episode, I speak to Christian Hug, Vice President of LifeWorks and Inclusion at Discovery Communications. He has an incredible 17 and a half years at the company, driving forward the diversity, equity and inclusion strategy. He has an MA in Human Resources Management, he's a business coach and intercultural trainer, bringing with him the personal experience of living and working across cultures and regions. We talk about the pitfalls of applying a one-size-fits-all to DEI within a global company, and Christian offers insight in how Discovery has worked hard to ensure the DEI work has relevance in each country. Christian also shares how best to gain leadership, allyship, and advocacy. He speaks with passion about his work and is a true model for inclusive leadership. Enjoy. Christian, welcome to the Why Care podcast show. I'm so excited. I'm really excited to have you on here. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise, Nadia. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you get into working into the space of diversity, equity, inclusion? Everyone's got a journey and a story to share with regards to this. So what's yours?
So the very short version is that I'm at Discovery and I am in year 17, which I had never anticipated.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I've got different careers, I would say, at Discovery. So partway in or halfway in almost as an HR generalist or HR practitioner, I took a sabbatical. I took a break. I had started working in the UK. I moved to Germany and had an EMEA, a pan-regional role. And through lots of reorganizations and different changes in the business, I just needed some time off. I needed a break. I had moved my life from one country to the next. Anyway, I came back and I was offered a role to look after the space of health, well-being, and inclusion, which at Discovery is sort of a separate function in of itself. It's a specialist function like learning and development or compensation and benefits, with a pure focus being on the employee, their physical and mental well-being being one side, and really creating a culture of inclusion. And not so much the diversity angle where you say, in 2 years' time, I want to increase my diversity population by X% or something like that, what we're seeing lots in the media. It was really sort of coming from within, mirroring the culture that already had been well established in the US, where our mother company was located in DC at the time. And just really bringing that over to Europe and to international, setting up employee resource groups, where a lot of the engagement and initiatives are coming from, but also starting with raising awareness. That's where it usually begins, right? It's kind of bringing in speakers, having relationships with external bodies where you can bring in expert knowledge, talk to senior leaders about X, Y, and Z, what you're seeing, and then really creating that sort of lively culture of inclusion where we've been benefiting for many years from the US. It was my role to kind of mirror and do it differently and customize for the international population.
Why was that important to you? What's your passion and desire to make the EMEA area region more inclusive?
I'd have to go back probably to sort of my family in a way, and what I have been experiencing from very early age is that my family have always been very accommodating towards people from different countries. My parents, even before I was born, had people from Turkey living with them in the same house, and people from Spain and people from Italy. And this was in the 50s and 60s after the war. So my parents have always been very open, very accommodating. And my mom isn't really from the region where I grew up. So she was always a bit of an outsider to the rural space. Maybe that may have been actually the linchpin. So that said, I have actually sort of learned to translate what certain things mean. I've always find myself really curious listening to the differences that other cultures had. I've got two Italian uncles as well. And so with that all, I loved the differences, and I loved sort of when I studied English and I visited the UK and started traveling, I found it fascinating to sort of see the differences and then reflecting on what that means for me. And I guess I was trying to make sense of the world for myself and where I had come from, what this means, how do you sort of get by in life, learning about different systems, et cetera, and society as a whole. And I loved that. And I loved learning more about that. One of my sort of most mind-blowing experiences was when privately I traveled to India, and I absolutely loved it. The minute I stepped off the plane, I had the smell of the spices, and it's beautiful. I never thought I'd like it that much. And I have another experience. I once thought, what's the part of the world when I was living here where I wouldn't naturally go to? And so I looked at the map. This was in around 2005, actually. I thought, oh, Romania. So I traveled to Romania, hadn't been before, didn't speak the language. I was just curious. As you can probably get a sense, I love different cultures. I love different experiences and seeing how people live and traditions, etc. And so being able to get fully entrenched in that sort of space and get paid for it.
Bonus.
Right? It's wonderful. So,
yeah. So tell me then, I'm interested in your work in Discovery. You've been there a while, as you've just mentioned. So what have you noticed that's evolved with regards to diversity and inclusion in Discovery over the years?
Yes, we first brought the concept of an LGBT group to the UK, a concept of women's networks, family forums, really looking at our demographics and seeing what makes sense to begin with in the UK and then the other offices and the larger markets. And to really sort of starting to, when I say mirror the discussion or bring that to Europe or to the international part of the business, it wasn't so much a copy paste. The mindset was probably a bit of copy paste, yet the dialogue and the discussion on the ground were a lot more, well, how does that resonate? Mean for the evolution of X in the UK, etc. We were mirroring our guiding principles and giving it local relevance. And that was kind of just really aligned with our culture.
I'm curious there, what you've just said around giving it local relevance, because a lot of the workshops when I run, sometimes there isn't any choice but to use US content because there isn't any UK content. For example, a lot of the discussions are happening in the US and it's relevant conversations, but sometimes it can turn UK participants off going, even just simply with a US accent, they sort of switch off and go, well, how can I apply that here? Why aren't we having these sort of discussions in the UK? Can't you use UK content? I can't conjure up UK content, obviously, but how do you do it at Discovery? How do you make it relevant to your region?
So we have got employee resource groups and they're dotted across the different regions. They have co-chairs in different regions. So for example, taking the Black Lives Matters movement that really has actually given a lot more focus to the whole discussion. It almost dialed up the seriousness of why we were doing this. We have a multicultural alliance that is out of the US that they run events. And we have what we call the MCA, Multicultural Alliance Monday. And that talks, and that's usually US led, but we also have a UK takeover, or we have an Asia Pacific takeover. So that MCA Monday becomes a discussion, a dialogue where actually just this week with Asian Heritage Month, there was that focus being given towards the Asian community and actually our Asian Multicultural Alliance. And the UK has done an amazing discussions, bringing in Steve Lawrence's brother last year for a discussion and a debate. So again, making it locally relevant. Whilst there might be the discussion in the US about systemic racism, in the UK, it might be a little more about mixed race. That's where maybe the translation comes in. And also in the UK, one talks a lot about social mobility, which is something that's not so common in the US. So you just got to find those nuggets and the differences. And, in some countries, I'm thinking outside of the UK now as well, when you look at the Multicultural Alliance in Asia Pacific, what the definition of their work is, it stretches when you start with India, actually, where they're talking about tone of skin or color of skin, which is quite relevant because the North is a lot more fair-skinned in India to the South. And there's so many ethnicities within India, which is like, in and of itself is incredible. It's fascinating. So I think it's just giving really focus to the different continents and regions where we're in, and then listening in on those stories. And for example, some countries, when I think of Asia now, we actually have the topic of LGBT wrapped into the multicultural discussion as well, because it so makes sense for us. Now, it may well in the future be a different discussion that we spin off the LGBT focus. That's also evolutionary, how these dialogues and discussions grow. In Singapore, for example, you do not speak about LGBT.
I was thinking that it's surely not necessarily within their culture something that is openly and overtly discussed. I'm curious then, is that something that we then as diversity inclusion experts, specialists, need to acknowledge and accept that culturally there are people, no doubt, Singaporean or in the APAC region, who identify with being in the LGBTQ plus community, but because of their culture, they will cover and they won't be open about it, and that we have to accept. So, because very much in the UK, the stance is actually covering is harmful. It's not good for your mental health. We want everyone to feel like they can belong and be their true selves. And that's ultimately what diversity inclusion stands for. So how do you then adapt when the national culture or the sort of the regional culture doesn't allow people to be open about who they are?
The beauty, again, when you work across regions, you can pick speakers and activities from another location. For example, Asia Pacific for us at Discovery also encompasses Australia, India, Japan, Taiwan, and these are very open to the LGBT discussion, very open countries. So what we would do is we would host an event and speakers might be attending and be overtly speaking about those topics, and they're located in another country. And then it's okay. And we make sure also we're posting internally discussions, events on all of the different pages, intranet pages or workplace pages, as we call them. It's like a Facebook, an internal one, so that it's absolutely critical that even in places where certain dialogues and discussions aren't being had, that the employees know that there is solidarity, and they know that our culture is far more embracing of, say, the LGBT or a certain religion than what may be the case from a sort of a national viewpoint.
This is the challenge I find for global organizations, where you've got national culture or local cultures interacting with the organizational culture. So what I'm hearing you say there is that we want people to know, everyone who works for Discovery, doesn't matter where they work in the world, that at Discovery, we embrace difference and they can be who they are. And that might be misaligned then, or not necessarily exactly the same as their local culture and where they were brought up and their lived experience of whether they'll be accepted for who they are in their country. Is that right?
Yeah, you've just paraphrased our mission statement, actually, in that case.
There you go.
Beautifully, right? Bringing your whole self to work is what we want. We want people to bring their whole self to work and feel comfortable. I mean, when you think about Discovery as an organization, we are telling diverse stories on TLC, on HGTV, on content that we're putting out there. And it really starts from within. It starts from us as human beings on a simple human level. There may be human rights that may not be tolerated or accepted in the same way as we, with a Western mindset, we may think that they need to be embraced. And we absolutely make sure that, take Russia, take Brazil, some countries sadly had backlashes of certain topics. Even Poland within Europe, Poland, Hungary, we have a large presence and population base in Poland. We do panel discussions, and I'll pick the LGBT space, to show solidarity to our employees that it's in focus. Your country culture or country current situation might be in dire straits when it comes to the LGBT topic. However, within Discovery, you may not feel comfortable to be open and out. I get it, right? Or we get it. This is not just about the 8 to 10 hours of the day that you're at work when you go out and leave. And if they're facing anything that is off against our ethics, our values, there are clear processes in place for them to really also go back and get that protection internally. And also things like transgender guideline that we have, or transgender policy supporting the trans community. Now, it may be a very small population that actually are going through gender reassignment. What things like these and discussions do, it's not just about the population who we have. It's also about their network, their family members, their friends, right? Doing the right thing in the space of gender diversity, in the space of caring responsibilities, if we're kind of broadening again the scope. I may not have kids, but the fact that the company is looking well after families, that makes me feel proud working at Discovery. And that whole inclusion discussion, I think that's also what we always sort of refer to. It's not just about the demographics that we replicate. It's about everybody else, because we all are diverse ultimately.
I'm curious then, as a global organization, you have teams working globally across different geographic regions. So what then are the challenges that you see working cross-culturally? Do you have examples of when differences meet culturally and how that can be a challenge?
What would be a piece of advice maybe to others is, it's great to set a strategic direction and to have a philosophy or some principles in place that you can really hang your activities on. And then I feel what's really important, and I think we've started doing this at Discovery more so last year, since actually the Black Lives Matter movement, to be honest, to really set that strong global direction with 5 mosaic work streams, is what we call them. They're very business-oriented objectives and work streams in that space. And then there is a push towards them being interpreted on a very local level, because the gender discussion in Russia is for sure a very different one to, say, the UK, Italy, Spain, Latin America. And often we refer to Asia Pac as one region. But when you look at the countries we're operating within, even a country in and of itself, as I mentioned, India, they're so diverse within them. So it's just fascinating. So that you need to give empowerment and accountability to a local level, and then follow through, making sure that local definition exists, local activities exist, and people are being held accountable towards those locally set goals, whatever they may be. And you can use synergies then on a pan-regional levels, et cetera. But ultimately, it's you set the direction and then you push the efforts to a local level and get some red tape around it, or provide some rigor in form of what we have a steering committee, where you just highlight the importance so that things don't fall off the wagon.
So have you got an example maybe of how in one country they've made it more relevant to them in a certain way compared to the US or another country?
Let's start with one work stream that I was actively involved. One of the 5, I can name them if that's of help. We've got unconscious bias and making sure that the training is mandatory so everybody learns about their own biases. At number 1. Number 2 is looking at supplier diversity. And that means just really looking at where do we give most of our money, who do we give most of our money to, and do they actually mirror and match our values? That's not to say that we would pull contracts immediately. I think the approach would be more to go into some sort of dialogue and say, what is important to us is X, Y, the representation of comes across as X. How can we help you? It would be more that sort of dialogue approach that we would probably be seeking on an off-screen talent. So content diversity, we call it, and social good, and then recruitment and development. So some are externally focused, some are product focused, some are internally focused, if that makes sense. There's one example I can give you, and that's unconscious bias. We rolled out unconscious bias training globally to the entire population. And so starting with a training or a basic training, for lack of better words, that we had in 3 sections, focusing on understanding bias, respect, integrity, and allyship, is what we could have rolled out as one product for our global population, 10,000 people. What we decided we were going to do, though, is to take a look at how do these examples, where they're going to translate in the different markets. So we ended up engaging with human resources, or people and culture, as it's called in Discovery, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Japan, in Singapore, in Taiwan, in Korea, in India, in Russia, and so on, across really the larger offices. So we ended up with about 30 nuanced unconscious bias trainings. They all were recorded in local language rather than buying an off-the-peg product that we roll out and say, well, look, here's subtitles. This may be in Spanish and French and your native tongue. Go figure. We spend an enormous amount of time with the person recording the training to say, so which examples in these instances are more culturally appropriate? Do we use a gender example? Do we use a ethnicity-related example? Is it then going to be something about mixed race? Is there stuff about calling people in or out when certain discussions happen? And really making it culturally acceptable, for maybe a lack of better words?
Essentially, I suppose what you're saying is that you're tailoring it so that it resonates with the intended audience in a better way, and so therefore that they can use it and apply it more in their own setting. So you're making it easier for them to apply, basically.
Exactly. This is the time where you can really get people hooked to the diversity and inclusion discussion. It starts with one's own awareness. And if you fail to make that effortless, then I think it's a lot harder to gauge people's interest or garner people's interest in sort of furthering the conversations. So we wanted to have people make a connection to the topic and to their own experiences and to their own behaviors, really, because it's not about clicking an online through an online training. It's really about the behavioral shift, after all, and what it does, obviously.
I'm interested, particularly because you're talking about unconscious bias training and how to make sustainable change, because a lot of the pushback on unconscious bias training is that highlights that people are biased, but it doesn't then help them, support them in actually doing anything with it, that it's not sustainable change, that it's a one-off kind of sometimes 90-minute session that then what do people do with and how do they apply it? So do you think that in tailoring it to each local region and making it more specific so that they can apply, do you feel that the impact has been enhanced, and have you measured it in some way? Do you know the benefits of that training?
We haven't measured it yet. We will measure it, though, again through our global employee surveys that we do repeatedly. So it's too new to say that, to be honest. What we have, though, started doing is engage senior management, and we've had workshops with leadership teams to really deepen the conversation. And we're now also following up with discussions by function, as well as by geography, and it's really about airing that conversation, giving that conversation space and room, and showing that it is important. This is not something that you check the box, the inclusion agenda. Something that when you're hooked as an ally, that's ongoing, right? You're either fascinated or you're a senior sponsor of some sort, right? You're either fascinated by it and you stand by a certain group. And we've always said, for example, the Women's Network isn't doing the panel discussion just for women to learn more about how can I have a better career or have a different self-esteem or hear different stories to then relate to me. What am I going to do? It's actually also about men listening in. What is the experience of women in the workplace? And the same for any other groups that we have. If you just cater towards men or women, you may not cater towards a lesbian woman, right? Or if you have a person of different ethnicity, and you might just be covering the ethnicity piece, but not maybe the fact that we're talking about women. So I think what's really interesting is that we're combining more and more the efforts that we're doing. We've had the family forum also talk about rainbow families, the modern family, really making sure that we're joining the dots and it's not in silos, because it's really about personal enrichment by listening to the different stories that are being shared, the different needs that are out there. And I think we can all benefit, grow, and take better decisions ultimately ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. There are different communities talking and sharing and wanting to better understand each other. Because that's some of the risks with ERGs sometimes, is that it can just be, well, you're in this box, but actually, and people do, obviously multiple diversity characteristics would align themselves, but the intersectionality is so key. And I think also makes it massively complex, this area of diversity and inclusion that we're trying to navigate, because it's so individual. Everyone's got an individual life experience. Just because I'm a first generation UK born ethnic minority female, that doesn't mean that another woman with exactly those same characteristics will have the same lived experiences as me, will have the same needs and requirements as me. And I think what you overlay and what you're talking about with regards to discovery is the additional complexity of, you're not simply UK based, or you're not simply German based, or you're not simply US based. It is global, and that cultural mix and the heritage and the local nuances at play makes it massively challenging, I would have thought, to navigate and make sure everyone feels like they belong in discovery.
And you'd be surprised about the creativity. One minute you think, oh, okay, what are we going to do for XY event? That we have done great stuff last year and I haven't heard any of the groups step forward with an idea. The next minute, you may or may not have been in touch with them. They post the most amazing campaign on our intranet page that you think, oh, this is great. Well, let's make this bigger. Let's share this, tweet this. We have local employee resource group sites because we want people to post stuff in local language that is totally acceptable and then comment on it. Yet we also have respective global pages. So we would have a global women's network page, we'd have a global pride page, and so on. We have a global disability. That's actually the only virtual one that we have that is global. It's called ABLE-D, a group for people with special needs, seen and unseen disabilities. And really what people are doing locally in their markets, I sometimes tweet onto the global page because it so deserves to be seen by a broader audience, or we encourage them straight away to share it outside. And I think this is all about the learning. It's all about the enriching yourself, broadening your mind. And it so is in tune with Discovery's overall mission and value statements. So I think we've been lucky to be in the early days when I set up the function, learning, like I said earlier on, from the US. Now I think internationally that we got the cart rolling. It's so much multifaceted. I'd almost like to say that the reason I'm still doing this job all these years in is there is so much learning still. It's fascinating to hear about the many different cultures, the lived experiences, etc. And it actually makes you very humble when you listen to some of our people have experienced themselves or speakers that we bring in, also then brings home, we're living in one world. This is just one world. There's so many different experiences. And then you can look back and think, have I been privileged? Yes, in many ways on stages in my life, I have been extremely privileged. How can I use that privilege to better other people is the sort of self-dialogue that I'm having.
I'm interested because you mentioned allyship before as well, and you just sort of alluded to it. How can I use that privilege that I have? How do you encourage and embed that mindset within leaders, within Discovery and across regions?
I would say that most of our leaders, senior leaders, have lived and worked in other countries, so they would have firsthand experienced themselves what it's like. I think it's very hard to teach something, right, and get that spark going when it's not there. That's what my observation would be. You either have a passion and it's there and you build on it, and you need to find that nugget of what's the person's personal related story to the topic. And when you can sort of unravel that, you use that leader as a senior sponsor, as an ally, as a storyteller. And when you have several of them, you may not have everyone that leaps at the topic in the same and similar fashion. Some people might just also want to hold their personal stories back. They might not just be so extroverted, and that's to be respected. On the whole, I would say we've been extremely lucky that the leaders are, they get the topic intellectually. You don't have to kind of hammer it in. You just need to provide a bit of guidance as to where they could get engaged, how they can get engaged. And the fact that we have now cascaded our diversity, inclusion, goals, objectives, and definitions to a local level puts them fully in the driving seat. So that's wonderful. They can shape their own. They don't have to take what's coming down the corporate chain. It's now on you, leader. We're all in this. You've got a role modeling responsibility. And what we're doing, this is all reasonably new, right? I can't give you lots of experiences and success stories yet because, as I said, since the Black Lives Matters movement, we've really started to dial up this whole model.
What was it about Black Lives Matter that you think brought this to the fore?
Our senior leaders in the US and international, they openly shared that as a media business, there is a responsibility that we have in the storytelling that we do, but also the power that media has. We need to be, again, visible and in the driving seat of taking this topic seriously, and we need to help society, culture, educate, everything that we do, again, by our products, the stories we tell, etc. We need to also have a lot more focus on that internally, not just do it because it's the right thing to do it because this actually is the signature of our culture. And that's really so wonderful. You don't have to tell any of our leaders why it's good for business. They get it. Some have different views about it. And you would take those leaders, that's my approach typically anyway, you take those that actually totally get it, you showcase that, and the others will come, right? You're not going to have, out of 10 leaders, you might have 3 or 4 that really are getting it, they're fired up, they have a personal connection. Hey, use them, build them up, give them the platform to shine. The ones that are in limbo, that get it, they would want to do it, but for some reason haven't yet, they will, with the right personal conviction, they will also do it. And then you'll have probably a very small number of them left. Now, either there is corporate protocol and they'll have to come along and follow, not the best way. Ideally, though, because they're all intellectual people that we have, right, they will get that extra nudge and get their calling. And I think they may not know what they don't know at that stage when they embark on it.
There's a lot of that in diversity inclusion. You don't know what you don't know until you start this journey. It applies to all of us. I'm learning every single day as I have conversations with people like yourself, reading books, listening to podcasts. And every day I get this small aha moment, or sometimes a very large aha moment, where I just didn't realise. And I think that's that being comfortable with discomfort, with me recognising, 40 years into my life that I didn't know something, and probably I would have acted in a way that may have excluded someone in the past. but now I recognize that. And so I'm sitting with a level of discomfort, suddenly realizing and thinking, okay, but now I can do something with that information and that knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's far worse not to do anything, being shell-shocked, thinking I might be doing something wrong, and going out there and starting the conversation with curiosity, with a good intent. I think people will be a lot more forgiving should you put your foot into something that you weren't intended to do, even though I think the weariness helps in how you're phrasing things when you're not sure, and people will be forgiving for sure. That's been my experience when I've sort of gone out and spoken to communities that I have not been so familiar with. And I have walked away talking to the trans community last year and really wanting to understand what they're going through, trans men, trans women. And it's been awe-inspiring just being able to, again, what I was saying earlier, being able to do this for a living, get paid for it as well, personally enriched by it. It's just wonderful. And you build on it. And the next time you speak to someone in the trans community, you might actually be asking a lot more specific questions. And then empathy. I think empathy is so important, right? Just acknowledging what people may have gone through.
You've mentioned that Discovery have been on a huge journey just this past year, let alone everything, all the other work before then, but in particular this last year. So what have you uncovered that still needs work? What's the biggest challenge that you're seeing still needs addressing, still needs work?
Our topic where we can get better at is data. We've been doing so much for so long, for a decade now. We've been extremely privileged, not needing to turn around and giving finite metrics to justify the money where it's being spent and the impact it does, because it is very subtle and it's very difficult to do that. And I think we want to really be storytellers and make an impact. That's where we've gotten to from. This is good for business, we know that. This is good for our culture, we know that. We want to celebrate our successes and go out there and be bold about celebrating. And that's what we haven't been able to do in the past, simply because we haven't had the data.
I'll look forward to hearing very much about the impact that you're having, because no doubt it's incredible the extent of work that you're doing, the localization and the structure that you've put in place to make it work globally, to make it work locally. I'm very much keen to hear when you get that data in place, what you learn. So thank you so much, Christian. I absolutely love speaking to you. I can't believe we've already come to the end. It's gone.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's gone so quickly. Tell me, if those people interested in learning more about yourself and your work, how can they get hold of you?
Sure. For a start, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm probably not the best respondent to my LinkedIn page, admittedly. I would say I have a website privately with my coaching practice, which is Christian-Haag, my surname.net. If you drop me an email on that, it could be totally discovery related, podcast related. I'm happy to answer it, although it goes into my private account. Try LinkedIn. My G Work is a website that we also are using for our vacancies. It's in the LGBT space. It's a partner that we've been working very closely with, where actually our LGBT colleagues are giving mentoring opportunities to the LGBT community, and potential new talent and employees can also find out what's the LGBT culture like. You'll find me registered on there as well. Be persistent if you want to get hold of me, and if I'm not responding is what I'd say. And for sure, I'll get back to you one day or another.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, everything that Christian and I have spoken about today, again, is going to be on the show notes page, which is going to be on the AvenirConsultingServices.com website, as usual, under podcasts. So, Christian, I've learned so much speaking to you today. Thank you. Absolutely wish you all the best with all of the work that you're going to continue doing at Discovery. That concludes episode 12 of the Why Care podcast. What a brilliant conversation. Christian's energy for diversity, equity, inclusion is infectious, and it's so clear he truly loves what he does. Some amazing insights for global organisations on how to roll out DEI at a local level. Do let Christian and I know what you thought of today's show. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram with the handle @NadiaNagamutu and @Avenir Consulting Services. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the word by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks, as always, to Mauro Kenji for editing this podcast and John Rice for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.